name is Helena Webb. I work in the Innovation and Design Center, team for Zebra Technologies as a user experience designer. I'm going to talk about something a little bit different today, the psychology of user experience. And I'd like to start with why it means so much to me. So I'd like to think of myself as quite a practical, hands-on person. I've grown up competing in sports, playing piano, and painting technical portraits and making things. It was around 5 years ago that I noticed something was wrong. I was training for a national rowing competition, which was a really big deal to me back then, and I couldn't finish my training session. My body wouldn't let me because I was shaking too much. So at the time, I just got really annoyed by it. It was an inconvenience. I wanted to finish my session. And so I tried to ignore it and try again the next day. But as you can probably guess, it didn't go away. And so, although I might be a little bit nervous today, I've actually been diagnosed with an essential tremor. So this affects the right side of my body. And it means that everything I loved doing before, the making and creating things, all became a little bit harder. I could no longer take it for granted that my body would be able to perform these tasks. So I had to take a step back, and I had to think about each one of those actions and how I could still perform them. So with rowing, I focused on my technique. I no longer could rely on my strength to win a race. With piano, I tried to do more improvisational pieces. So I tried jazz piano. Turns out jazz piano is really hard, so I gave up with jazz piano. And when it came to making and creating things, I put thought into the process. What made a creation better? And it was this thought process that led me on to mechanical engineering. So there's me. I was a mechanical engineering student in Coventry University in the Midlands in the UK. And it was also that same thought that led me to try out user experience. So a year ago, I joined Zebra Technologies and the Innovation and Design team. And I applied that same thought strategy that had worked with all these other tasks. I started looking at how users interacted with interfaces, be it your laptops in front of you, or if you go shopping and there's a kiosk, or even your mobile phone, which you use every day. I started looking at what people did intuitively and that they didn't have to learn. So I'm going to talk through the psychology with a few key examples. So let's start with a basic one. I can say that most people in this room started reading that with that top sentence, "Hey Neptune," and then moved on to the second. Seems pretty basic, but let's understand the psychology behind it. So in many cultures, we read from the top left, sorry, I'm facing the wrong way, top left to the bottom right. So you look to the top of the page for that quick information. When we have a new screen in front of us, we want to get as much information as quickly as possible, which is why we read from the top and why titles are at the top. We also see the bigger, bolder text. So with my next example, I'm going to ask you a question. If this was a device in front of you, and you were to tap that icon in the top left corner, what would you expect to happen? Back? Okay. So let's talk about what we mean by back. The arrow is pointing outside of the screen currently. It's pointing to something that you can't currently see, which means that when you tap that, we intuitively think that it's going to show us something that we can't currently see. Also, let's go back to my first example, where we read from the top left down to the bottom right. That arrow is placed in the top left, which is where we started reading from. So we associate that with the first thing. So if we look back to that top left corner, we associate that movement with going backwards. We've seen that already. My next example, an arrow, that same arrow icon, but now in the center of a page. So just have a think, what would you think would happen if you were to tap that icon? Would you expect the rest of the page to move? No. Yes, I heard someone say expand. Exactly. So the arrow is pointing within the screen. It's pointing to a place that you can already see. So we intuitively believe that it's going to populate that space rather than show us something completely new or shift the rest of the page. These aren't learned examples. And if you put them side by side, the way that I like to think about this and explain it is it's sort of like the same way you move around a house. If you're in a living room, let's say, and there's a door leading to somewhere else. Oh, actually, of course. There we go. If you're in this space, if the arrow is pointing to somewhere that you can't currently see, it's like you're moving to an additional room. It's like you're, let's say, in this first room, moving into the bathroom. Whereas if there is an arrow populating that same space, it's much like a kitchen cupboard. You'd expect to open it, but you wouldn't expect the whole room around you to change. It's just that expanding, it's that revealing something new in that space. And this is something that I thought was quite cool as well, is we all think of that top left as bag. You said it straight away, I heard it a few times. But in other cultures around the world, they read from the top right to the bottom left. And so it's reversed. And so user experience design has to reflect that and has to think about the psychology of that user. If they read from the top right, they associate that with the first thing that they've seen, and they would then associate that with back. So more like an interaction like this. And that's also reflected, this is an example from the material design library. So you can see what I'm talking about. For this next part, I'd like to talk about interactions and animations. So it's not all just about the visual design. Animations are a key way of showing familiarity to a user on a device that they've never used before. So if we look at that top box here, it's moving linearly from one side of the screen to the other. But that doesn't happen that much in daily interactions. If I were to put this on the floor and slide it along, there is that initial friction that it has to move. So it has to speed past it and then slow down. So it's almost like a curve of how quickly it moves. Or that same thing with pulling open a kitchen drawer. There's that initial thing and there's a slowing down when it comes towards you as well. So a more human interaction would be this second box. It's a little bit laggy. But these actually take the same time to pass from one side of the screen to the other. But it gives the user that sense of familiarity. My next example with interaction and animation is positive feedback. I think in another talk just earlier you mentioned that there was a vibration in a device and that was a quick way of giving feedback. Well, another example is visual ripples. So if I'm to press this button here, the lighting on this button changes and you get that feel, that bounce back, but also something visual happens. And we can replicate that in user experience. So now when a user has one of our devices in front of them and they tap, they don't need to question whether the transaction's gone through. And if we're on a laptop, for example, you can't have that vibration. You might be able to have sound in that case, but this is a visual way of giving that positive reinforcement. This is an ongoing project at Zebra. We have been working on creating similar to material guidelines, a component library using these same principles and thought patterns to create intuitive user experience across all of our enterprise devices. It's not quite available yet. It's a It's a continuous development. However, we strive for consistency, and so something that is available is our icon library. This is clear-cut designs that we believe are intuitive to a user, and there is a live link, so if anyone's particularly interested for their own app development, come and speak to me afterwards, and I'd be more than happy to share that. So I've got one last example and one last question. We might all recognize these as app icons on a mobile device. But my question to you is, why do you think that on these icons, the corners are rounded? Does anyone have any idea? What do you think? Less strict? Okay. Any other examples? You can move them around? Okay. Pardon? Yes. That's actually, so I spoke to my colleagues about this, and that was one of their suggestions. So if you didn't hear him, he said, it makes it more inviting to tap because you don't feel like it's going to prick your finger if there's round edges. Or someone else also said, well, it kind of looks like a telephone button, so I want to tap it. All of these are completely valid. It could be any of those. And to be honest, I'm not sure which one it initially was. But the point I'm making is, if it's deliberate and you're thinking about the psychology of the user, yes, they might want to tap it because there's soft edges, and yes, they might want to tap it because it looks like telephone buttons. But as long as you've got the user and the way that they're thinking at the forefront of every design. So I'd like to leave with one final thought. The psychology of user experience has enabled me to continue doing what I love, to continue designing and creating. And it is a pleasure and a privilege to be here today with several companies that share that ethos. Thank you. Any questions?